Radio has existed as a medium for over 100 years. Its uses have ranged from talk shows to music to sports broadcasting, even public service announcements. Before it became a public medium, it was initially created as a communication device. Developed by Guglielmo Marconi in the 1890s, the first radio transmission was an experimental communication called telegraphy without wires. It was only later that the technology was used beyond just as a means of talking to others.
They can trace it back into the 19 teens, like 1913. There was a station at the University of Wisconsin that began broadcasting just around there in radio. But some of the first broadcasts were on KDKA in Pittsburgh. They did the first World Series in 1921. And then the presidential elections and the returns were broadcast in 21 or 20, I think. So it was either 20 or 21 when they really started doing that. But the radio problem was anybody could put a radio station on the air if they had a set and a crystal, and then they could just start broadcasting on any frequency. So the FCC came along in 1927, and that was a government agency that took over control of AM radio because FM didn't exist then. And then in 1933, the FCC, there was a new radio act in 1933 or 4 that allowed people, and before that they allowed people to have frequencies, but they decided in the 20s that the radio signal belonged to the people. So that's why you have the idea of public interest in radio law. That's where they always say it's got to be in the public interest.
During World War II, radio was a big player in informing the general public on what was occurring on the front lines. It was this sense of urgency that gave radio its mark even still today.
Radio has the ability of being, it's the ultimate immediacy. You know, TV, like let's say a breaking news story happens and 3 different individuals get there at the same time. Someone from TV, someone from radio, and someone from internet. Internet relies on, you have to rely on that you've got a good data signal and software and some other stuff, and it's going to take a minute to get set up and get rolling. And maybe there are people there that can get stuff going, but to cover that news event. TV takes even more time, right? You got to have a van and a transmission and all kinds of set up the saddle, whatever. And a lot of that goes through the internet as well. These days, with radio, somebody can just show up and make a phone call to the radio station and you're on the air, just like that.
After the war, radio had to find other ways to stay relevant, and a major portion of that was shifting primary efforts to focus on entertainment.
Radio was a way to get music out there, different songs, different genres, different artists. If it wasn't for radio, at least in the beginning, people like Elvis Presley wouldn't have ever existed. And so I think radio, even to this day, is still kind of like that. You know, it helps boost up numbers on the charts, even on like streaming services. If you hear a song on the radio that you really vibe with, you can Shazam it, and then you can have it right in your library on your phone. And so radio just is a place for everyone to come together over the love of music, or the love of talking, or sports, if you really want to get down that road.
Entertainment drove the radio industry. Talk shows where people could listen to their favorite personalities, music that everyone could enjoy, radio productions of novels such as War of the Worlds, which had initially been taken as factual but was only meant to be just entertainment. This radio entertainment brought people together in a scale greater than ever thought possible.
I think that having radio, it's such a localized thing. That's really just due to the technology. Like, a radio tower can only reach so far. And so it's got to have that local feeling to it. And I think it's really important to stay connected to where you're living. I think it's really easy with the internet and with how connected we are to kind of escape. And I think there are times, I do it myself. I definitely do that myself. But I also think, where there's times to not have to get out of where you're from and connect to where you're living.
However, as the years went on, radio seemed to be losing its hold on the public's interest.
I don't think a lot of students at this point are like growing up listening to the radio like I did, listening for new songs, and you'd have a blank tape ready so that if a song came on that you wanted, you could hurry and push record. And then, yes, I finally got Metallica, Enter Sandman recorded so I can listen to it anytime I want.
What happened was when TV came on, they started radio, had to go from the evening shows, or they were broadcasting at 7, 8, 9, and 10, just like they do prime time on TV now. That was prime time programming. So they had Fibber McGee and Molly, the Lone Ranger, soap operas during the day on radio. So when TV came on, then they started to move things from radio to TV. And then the TV stations everybody thought radio was going to be dead, but a couple of guys in Omaha started the Top 40 format, and all radio started to format different sounds, so you could pick and choose. If you were in Salt Lake or Los Angeles or other big cities, you could pick and choose whatever you wanted to listen to. And that's still going on today.
Despite what seemed like a death to the medium, radio did what it did best. It adapted.
The radio survived by going to different formats. And they're still doing that. But now the reintroduction of radio is really through podcasting that people choose to listen to. And 20 years ago, if you told them they had to listen to it, they probably wouldn't. But now they're doing all kinds of programming.
People aren't turning on the radio for whatever show as much, maybe hardly at all. But, if we can just keep things interesting and keep teaching students how to communicate well, and then, move stuff online and learn a lot more than just radio, I think it can be valuable.
As an instructor on radio broadcasting, Ryan understands the importance of both the medium as well as the people needing to learn to adapt.
If I'm doing my job, I'm at least up on the trends so that my students are up on the trends, so that if they go out and start working in radio, they're at least current, right? And if I'm doing a great job, I'm a little ahead of those types of trends. So I think I see a little more creativity in programming, maybe not just music, but again, that gets difficult because if we started playing, the most popular podcasts,
so we have
well,
30
cool, but
seconds.
maybe someone listening at that time doesn't care about podcasting, so then you're limiting your audience. But then you're limiting it even if the variety of music that we play, we're limiting our audience to people who just want that variety. So that's a hard thing. But I think some creativity in programming is going to be maybe the way that the radio evolves.
With so many changes happening with the world today, it can be easy for broadcasters to feel left in the dust. But those who know not to reject the new formats, but rather embrace them, find themselves succeeding in this media form.
The internet has made radio more accessible because my parents live in Arizona and they can actually get the station from their phones through streaming and everything, and they get to listen to a station that's not even near them. And so I think the internet has helped in some ways, but also not helped in some ways, because it's provided more outlets for other people to get creative.
It's kind of, a lot of it's moved to social media. I get more and more suggestions on my Instagram of other radio show hosts, some younger ones too, which again is exciting for me to see, and they're like from all over the country. And it's like younger people, they're doing small video TikToks of themselves, and they're easily 20s, 30s doing radio. And I actually am, pleasantly surprised to see that. But it's really fun. And it's almost like they're doing just regular online content, but I really enjoy the twist that it has with being a radio station. And so it's exciting for me to see them being able to use newer technologies whilst having the spirit of the old system and organization. I'm very curious to see where it goes from here. Because I talk a lot about how the biggest audience for them for radio has really been music, and still is music.
It's not that way anymore. People learn about new music and new artists from the internet, from outside sources other than radio. So radio has to adapt to that and recognize, and it's happening, right? Fewer and fewer employees at radio stations, and stations go out of business, but there are still stations, there's still growth new stations coming in here and there, and if we can use the internet to promote our product, to keep listeners engaged and interested, and then that's how we can, I think, survive.
The internet, smartphones, television, all these new technologies, while awesome and useful to the right people, still pose a dangerous question for radio. Will it be outcompeted and die?
And they've declared it dead a couple of times, especially when all these different platforms came out. And the internet now carries radio stations all over the place. And so they reintroduce themselves there. So I don't think it's ever going away.
Radio continues to adapt and do some of the stuff we've talked about, and help with concerts and events, and have a social media presence and create online content. I think radio will continue to be relevant. I think at some point also, if you think about an emergency situation, cell phones cannot always be there. There are situations where, and you'd see it in movies, like, I don't know, you could pick a number of movies and go, well, it's a good thing radio and somebody knew how to be a ham operator, right? And not to be like, well, like, see, but that the reality of that, I think, is there. And so, and there's, I don't know, to me, and maybe I'm just old-fashioned, but there's something special about, like, get in the car and just the radio just comes on. And I know, like, Bluetooth automatically connects and your music can automatically connect. And probably in a lot of places, like back east, you can drive from one town to another and never lose internet signal. But I spent a bunch of time in Wyoming and Oregon, and there are hundreds of miles of road that you drive from one town to another and you have no internet. So, and again, you can download podcasts and whatever else, but there's something, I think, unique about turning on the radio and hearing, oh, I love this song. And I don't know, I believe and I hope that doesn't ever go away.
I don't know. I do not think radio could die. I think it might get less in popularity, but I don't think it'll forever go away. Just because radio is something that has been around for so long, and if it's surpassed, like, the test of time, more or less, it's going to keep going for a while. At least in my lifespan, I hope, because I want a job in this field.
There's just always going to be people who are going to love the radio. I mean, a lot of people thought movie theaters would die with television streaming, and it's certainly changed. Don't get yourself wrong about that. Like, families going to the theater is kind of a thing of the past. Parents are like, I can keep my children at home. We can watch a new movie for the same price, if not cheaper. We can make our own popcorn, that kind of thing. I think that it's certainly on a new direction. Like, radio has had its heyday, and it's sort of plateauing right now, and maybe even dropping a little bit. But it's in a moment of change, in a moment of transition. I don't think it'll ever die, personally.
If it doesn't die, I think radio could evolve in the sense of getting more youthful DJs and more DJs who connect with people on different levels, and also utilizing different social medias like TikTok, Instagram. Radio stations that can do that get really high rankings. I mean, the guy Brew on TikTok, he's a radio disc jockey. People know him, people love him, and he's youthful, he knows what he's doing, and he's on TikTok and his platforms and everything, and so he gets those stations' numbers bumped up.
Some of my goals are involved with trying to get it a little more connected onto the internet without losing that spirit, which, I guess you could say really about anything, and I'm sure a lot of people are saying that, but that's something that I've thought about more, especially just here at college, and here at SUU, just trying to make those connections happen, make those ideas happen in my mind, just small things that we can maybe do involving ourselves online, or, changing the format if we have to. Like I said, like maybe having to drop a little more music for a little more talk show and involve those relationships more.
The hope for the future of radio still seems alive and well if Christina and Cormick have anything to say about it. While not as popular as it once was, there are still up-and-comers who desire to be a part of this century-long industry. And as long as that drive and passion remains, people will listen. Radio will adapt with new formats and still manage to find its audience. And there will always be modern radio.